Welcome to Bounce Back Stronger, the podcast that explores ways to find peace and purpose no matter what happens. I'm your host, Donna Ferris, and today we have author and seasoned business professional Garry Cosnett with us. A little about Garry. Garry's mission is to report from the other side of depression. His book, Everything Slows Down, chronicles his decades-long battle with depression and his life beyond it. I'm so looking forward to exploring the practices that helped him stay resilient with this mental health challenge that affects so many. Garry, thank you for joining us on Bounce Back Stronger. I'm so honored to have you on the podcast.
Thank you, Donna.
And we met through one of my friends and fellow Virgos. You may not know this about her, but fellow Virgos, Erin Garrett. It was so nice of her to connect us.
Yes, she came across my book and she thought this would be a good connection to make.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate it. I'm so thankful to have you.
Thank you.
So, Garry, maybe tell me a little bit about your journey with depression and how it's shaped your life.
Well, it started before I knew what the word depression meant. I
Right?
came from a fairly unsophisticated family. Neither of my parents graduated from high school. And we had an aunt that suffered from depression, but they would use euphemisms to talk about
Mm.
what her problem was. Then my mother developed a profound depression and retreated into her bedroom for several weeks. Now we're doing this about every 6 months,
Mm.
and still we didn't use the D word. So I was started when I was about 15, had my first depressive episodes, whatever I call them. It wasn't until about 7 years later when I was living with a sophisticated girlfriend who said, "You're depressed." And I
Mm.
thought, that sounds right. Yes, I am. And she took me very quickly to the community mental health center in the community.
That's really great that you found somebody that could identify it and support you.
Yes, both of those things.
And you wrote your book and it's called Everything Slows Down. What do you mean by that?
When I am getting depressed, it is if there's a speed control on my
Mm.
back and it's being turned more and more to the slow range. And as it moves to the slow range, it also accelerates. So it goes slow more quickly. My
Oh,
wife tells me that she can tell by the way that I carry myself, my gestures, rate of speech can give her a really quick idea if I'm falling into a depression. So everything slows down is the processing of things internal, and it even affects my body.
and do you find that having people around you that know you and are able to help you identify it has been key to your management of depression?
Yes, absolutely. My wife is very medically savvy. She comes from a medical family, and she's very attuned to depression because apparently her first husband suffered from it, but would
Mm.
never own up to it, which was an interesting conversation we had on our first date.
Oh, that's good. That's so great. And it's so wonderful when we can talk about it. And then it just makes it so much easier for everybody to navigate.
Absolutely. The lack of communication about and around mental illness in general and depression specifically is really quite striking in this day and age. And I'd like to say that it's getting better. In some ways it is, but there at the same time there are people whose approach is to quiet it down because it's not something we should be talking about in a
Yeah.
good, healthy America.
Yeah. Well, I think people really misunderstand that it has genetic characteristics.
Yes.
It's not something you can't just tell somebody to cheer up. That's the kind of information we need to hear, I think, to understand it better.
You might as well be telling them to heal their broken femur. It's in many ways biologically based.
Yeah, I have anxiety. I have generalized anxiety and quite a few phobias. But at one point when I was working with my therapist, I was just, railing against the fact that I had it, right? That why did I get it?
Yes,
And she said, you might as well just be doing that against the fact that you have brown eyes. There's nothing you can do about it. It's just one of your characteristics.
yes, that's very well put. And
She's still my therapist.
okay.
That's a good thing to have.
Yes, absolutely. I meet with my psychiatrist every 2 weeks and do it quite religiously and have done that for many years. And that's part of what keeps me out of the hospital. I was actually hospitalized 5 times,
Mm.
most recently for 3 weeks. And I've found ways that I can avoid getting that sick that I have no choice but to go to the hospital.
And that's awareness, right? Some of it's externally
Yes.
people seeing you, but it's also building our own awareness of what's happening in our bodies, right?
And awareness of denial,
Mm-hmm.
because when I start feeling depressed, I will ascribe it to anything,
Yes.
you know,
Yes.
sunspot activity, solar storms, relative humidity. I
Yeah.
will come up with a very elaborate explanation of why I'm not getting depressed.
Yeah.
And now I've learned that that's a trigger that I should be thinking more accurately.
Yeah. That your body's giving you clues in many ways.
Yes,
Yeah, it's a very helpful partner in this if we pay attention, but it's hard to. And denial is a very wide river. We spend a lot of
yes,
time in it. At least I do too.
yes.
Maybe share some practices that have helped you manage and thrive beyond having other people see what's happening or you keying into your own feelings or regular practices that support you in your health.
Well, to stay with diagnosis for a minute,
Yeah.
have what I call the Abbey Road test.
Mm.
And I put the Beatles' Abbey Road side two on the turntable, and I will respond to it in one of three ways.
Oh,
I will
wow.
either love it because it's glorious music. I will have like a flat response, no
Mm.
response, or the most extreme is I will have a response of aversion.
Mm.
I really am not able to listen to the whole thing because I have such an aversion to it. Now, a doctor once said that I had ahedonia, which is the
Mm.
inability to enjoy things. But I said, I think I have anti-hedonia because not only can I not enjoy things as I do in that flat range, but I also have a strong visceral aversion to them. So I
Yeah.
have that diagnosis. I put on Abbey Road. I see where I'm at. And then I have work to do if I'm down in that flat range or that anti range.
Well, that's brilliant. It's a really insightful way of doing it. And I think a lot of people can relate to that because there are things in your day. I can look at burnout, for example. When I'm burned out, it's not the same thing as depression, but when I'm burned out, there's certain things that I normally would find joy in that I can find no joy in.
Yes.
So I love that you do that. I think that's a great idea for a lot of different use cases around mental health.
Yeah, it's something I cooked up myself, but it's really the most reliable indicator. That and listening to my wife, who has a wonderful way of letting me know
Yes.
so it doesn't raise my defensiveness or my denial.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
the
That's
first
really
thing that
helpful.
I do now when I'm moving into a depressive episode is really counterintuitive. And you hinted at it in some of your therapy when you were talking a couple of minutes ago. And the first thing that I do is I accept it.
Mm.
I accept it. I sit with it. I don't fight it because I've found that if I'm fighting it, I'm actually reinforcing and strengthening it. And if I just sit with it and say, okay, here we are, we're moving into depression. We've been here before. We recognize it. Let's accept that as a given and just sit with it. And that's always the first step after I take the record off of the turntable.
Right.
to sit with the depression.
Absolutely.
Sometimes that has such a powerful effect that it seems to be moving me in the other direction. That's not when I'm really moving toward one of these overwhelming depressions, which I'm essentially immobilized. But it always makes it better. And it also clears my head to think about what else do we need to do. So the second thing that I do is I look at my calendar and I figure out everything that's not absolutely imperative. I say, well, will I lose my job if I miss this meeting? Probably not. If I take 2 mental health days at the end of the week, will that affect my bonus? No, that's 10 months away. I really look at my calendar and I try to choreograph it to accommodate the fact that I'm getting depressed. And then the third thing I do is I always communicate with my doctor, who's very familiar with the Abbey Road test, and will ask me where I am on that dimension.
On the Abbey Road test. That's really brilliant. How long did it take you to get to those three things?
About 40 years.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's really true.
Yes,
I was thinking the same thing. Yeah.
I have good ideas. It takes me a little while to reach them because as I said, I was hospitalized 5 times. And interestingly, they're almost exactly 6 years apart,
Mm,
each one of my hospitalizations. So 6 5s are 30, then a year that I wasn't hospitalized, 35, then get up to the most recent one. It pretty much fills my life with either moving into or moving out of depression,
mhm.
except for the past year and a half, where I've really been largely free of depressive episodes and symptoms.
And do you have any thoughts on why that might be?
I think I've really mastered the ability to see myself from the other side of depression and kind of pull myself forward. Now, I will say that I still meet with my psychiatrist every 2 weeks.
Mhm,
I take medication, actually 3 psychiatric medications, and I take them religiously, irrespective of the unpleasant side effects, because the most unpleasant side effect that I know is being depressed.
mhm.
So I have to remind myself periodically.
Yeah.
And the other thing is being in the relationship with my wife, Kristen, to whom I dedicated the book. She is like my co-pilot,
Mm,
and she knows all these idiosyncratic ways that I respond and that I go in different directions that might be what you would think intuitively with the acceptance and things like that. She gets all of those things and really is like a co-pilot and sometimes the pilot and I'm the co-pilot. Sometimes I'm probably in the bathroom of the plane, but it's great having her. And I don't think I would be where I am without it. And I would not have written a book without her encouragement.
What has been the response to the book?
Well, the book really comes out of a 500-word essay that I did for my company's internal website.
Mm,
Every morning you get on and you see what the stock price is and see what's going on in the organization. And every once in a while they'll have an essay. And I wrote an essay, 500 words, called How I Bring My Full Self to Work.
mhm,
And I wrote it and I put it out there. I was very direct, talked about setbacks and treatments and hospitalizations and whatever. And this was the most read essay that was ever done on that website. I got about 200 responses on the website with people with comments and questions. And I
yeah.
responded eventually to all the questions that I got. And then I got another 20 or 25 emails to my personal email address because they didn't want it to be public on the web.
Yeah.
So it was really striking to me. I figured I'd just put this out there. I largely did it for myself, so I wouldn't have to explain myself. The people that I work with would understand why sometimes I'm not as sharp as I can be. And Kristen said, "You have a story to tell. You should write a book." And she might as well said that I should build a rocket ship in the backyard. I just thought that was preposterous, but she had the wise counsel, write 1 page a day. So I would
Mhm.
set the alarm for 15 minutes early. I'd come into this room, I'd start typing, I'd bang out a page. And then over the course of weeks, 1 page became three, three became five, five became seven. And I ended up with 45 pages. I had it sitting in our sunroom on the table, and my mother-in-law, who's a retired doctor, said, "Can I read this?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, after reading it, "You have the makings of a book here. You should continue." So that gave me the impetus and the charge forward and finish the book. The hardest chapter to write was the last chapter because that was beyond depression and into the world.
Mm.
And I had such a vocabulary for talking about depressed states, but I had a very limited vocabulary for talking about the wonderful way that I'm living now.
Mhm.
So I had many drafts of that and a lot of stuff in the wastebasket, but I finally got it to the point where it made sense and it rang true. And I could actually describe a life that was free to a large extent from depression.
And that's probably a really great process to write that down.
Yes, it was. Now it's very therapeutic. I have several of the books around the house because I pick them up whenever I'm feeling a little anxious.
Yep.
And I say, it's all contained in here.
Yeah.
Everything that occurred in this book is manageable ultimately.
Yeah.
And whatever's going on today, I'm sure I'll be able to manage that as well.
So how long ago did you write that essay?
The essay, I wrote it about a year before I started the book. And then the book took me almost 2 years.
Yeah.
So that was about 3 years ago. But interestingly, an influential person from the company said, "Would you be willing to do a live webinar on
Yeah.
depression?" And I said, "Sure." And we had somebody doing an interview of me live on the webinar. We had 500 people present in the auditorium. We
Wow.
had 700 people in listening rooms throughout the company. And my favorite listening room, because it was 11 o'clock in Baltimore, it was 4 p.m. in London. And they had the listening room that all went out for a pub crawl after the hour-long discussion of depression.
Oh,
But
wow.
we have a technology called Meeting Pulse, which records people's questions, and the moderator was using them. But I had about 108 that weren't covered, and I responded to all 108 eventually.
Had the company done something like that before?
No,
To maybe follow up on something that you said is that part of the reason you wrote the essay is so that people understood you and you could be yourself at work. It's really
yes,
helpful when you can talk about and verbalize the things that you have. Like I'm pretty open about what I have because it has helped my companies a lot, really. Because
yes,
I having anxiety lets me see all of the things. I'm always looking for the thing that's going to go wrong. You need to know that because I'm always going to be conservative about things. I need somebody to push me the other direction.
yes,
So it's those types of things that those dialogues. It's really helpful to have so that you can be valued for what you bring, but also be managed too.
yeah.
I
Well,
find.
it was on some level a selfish act by which I wrote that first essay because I wanted it to be known
Mm.
where I was coming from and what you might be seeing that
Yeah.
would be baffling to you.
Yeah, and there's a whole movement to bring something called mental health first aid to corporations so that
Yes,
managers can start to see that. It's something that it's starting to be embraced. So I'm hopeful that that will start to happen because people do tend to go first line to their supervisor And nobody wants them to get in the role of a therapist if they can help them find help quickly, because most people have really, really good resources for these things.
Yeah.
These things is not the greatest way of putting it. But these conditions, it's hard to know. Like the managers may not be aware because it's just not something that they're close to.
At the end of the webinar, we had first somebody from HR who
Good.
spent 20 minutes talking about resources and opportunities for people who are experiencing mental health issues.
Right.
And then we had the CFO come out and talk about a very open and direct conversation about what she learned today that she didn't know yesterday,
That's great.
which was terrific.
One thing I've seen people do in these open forums is, can you raise your hand if you know somebody that's been affected by depression? And everybody raises their hand because if you don't have it, then somebody you know and love has it. As I opened up with, it's so prevalent.
I have not yet met the individual who cannot point to someone in his or her life or his or her family. And
Yeah.
usually they'll talk about one and then all of a sudden they're talking about a second one.
And you said it so well. Many times we didn't define it in our heredity or in our past with our family. We didn't talk about it. We just knew something was off or something was not working out for them, is a lot of
My
times how it
first,
would happen.
I was in college in Indiana, my first psychiatric hospitalization. I called my parents and then I talked to my twin brother the next day and he said, "How's your asthma?" I said, "My asthma's fine." He said, "Oh, mother and dad said you were in the hospital for asthma."
Oh my. Yep.
So
Yep.
that was how clearly it was not a sound or reasonable topic in our family,
Yeah.
despite my mother's spells, which ultimately she had more hospitalizations than we could count.
Yeah.
When we
Yeah.
finally learned the D word and some ideas about how you might treat it.
Yeah. And it's sad too, because as we already touched on, it's a chemical imbalance in many cases.
Yes, and it's astonishing how chemical treatments can make that a whole lot easier.
Yeah.
The meds that I take, everybody's theory is they flatten you out, but I don't experience that. They don't make me happy at every moment of every day, but they just make it simpler and easier to be reasonable when
Mm.
these things do come up.
Yeah. I personally waited a long time before I started taking anything for anxiety. And when I did, it really made a huge difference. But I think they have to be paired, right? You need
Yes,
both. Yeah.
it's both a psychological and a physiological phenomenon, anxiety, depression, and they're actually very, very ancient. The further you go back in the history, you can even go
Yeah.
back to the Bible and you can, in the
You can
Old
see it.
Testament, read about depression, although that's not the term they used.
So maybe at this point, I just want to make sure that I give you time to share anything that you want to share that I missed during our conversation, which has been so great, Garry.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I will tell you, I speak to the psychiatrists at Johns Hopkins Hospital. I speak to the medical students. I speak to the psych residents. In fact, the psych residents, now my book is part of their curriculum,
How great is that?
which I'm really thrilled by. And I tell them when I finish my presentation, you are scientists. You are very, very good scientists. This is why you're sitting in this room today.
Mm.
But you're going to encounter people who are lost in this world and suffering deeply, perhaps beyond your imagination. Now, as scientists, I realize you have to see them as a set of symptoms for you to draw a conclusion and a diagnosis. But if you do only that, you're doing half the job.
Mm.
The other half of the job is bringing your humanity to encounter another person who is suffering deeply. And if you really are dedicated to the practices of psychiatry, you will be sure you bring both of these things every time. And then I follow up by saying, I've had a great number of psychiatrists in my life. I can tell you the three that didn't bring that second part to it, and I'm no longer with them as a result.
Well put. Well put. Well, I can't think of a better way to end a podcast with that thought of how important humanity in all the things that we do, but particularly in that profession is. Well, thank you so much, Garry.
Oh, Donna, this was an absolute pleasure on my part.
That's all for today. If you want to learn more about Garry and his book, those links will be in the episode notes. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this episode was helpful. If it was, please subscribe, drop a review, or share it with your friends and family. That's the best way to get it in the hands of those who may benefit. And if my daughters, Sienna and Sylvia, are listening, I just want you to know how proud I am of you, and I love you so much. Bye now.